Welcome to our faculty development workshop for gender inclusive housing, and thank you all so much for being here. And if you walked here, thank you for braving the weather. We appreciate it. We're very glad you're here with us today. Hi, everybody. My name is Hope Kroll. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am the Student Success Coordinator in the Office for Education Abroad. In that role, I work on our reporting. I also do some of our program assessment, and then I do coordinate with two colleges, ARCA and Lyman Briggs, on their programming as well. And today I am wearing a cream-colored sweater, and my hair is pulled back. We are doing this for accessibility purposes. Yes. Hi everyone, my name is Haley Ridge. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a program coordinator in the Office for Education Abroad. I work with the College of Arts and Letters and the College of Music, and I liaise with the Resource Center for Persons with Disabilities, the Center for Gender and Global Context, and SAME. I am wearing a gray sweater today with black pants, and I have red hair that is pulled back. Okay, so our agenda for today. We are going to review the former housing policy that was observed by the Office for Education Abroad. We will examine the catalyst for this change. We're also going to outline our implementation process. So once we created the policy, what have we been doing to implement this? We will identify the goals for the policy and also review the new policy with you. Further exploring the implementation, including goals and timeline. So who's involved in making sure that this is going smoothly for students. And then we'll also do some practice, and we're going to have some case studies for you to essentially apply what you've learned today to different situations. And then we'll also have time for Q&A at the end. By the way, this presentation has been adapted from a presentation that Haley and I gave at NASA Region 5 last year. It was pretty well received then, but we're going to go into greater depth for you today as the people here at MSU who are helping us implement the policy. Also, what we're presenting today are the procedural recommendations for the policy as of today, January 22nd, 2025. Please know that the recommendations could evolve and change as we're working to implement the policy. So on the screen here is EA's former housing policy, and it states housing assignments are determined using the gender provided in the student information system. Students are responsible for providing and updating their gender information in the student info system through the registrar's office. The gender reported by the student in the student info system will be used to determine housing assignments. It is MSU policy that arranged housing will not allow unmarried members of the opposite sex to sleep in the same unit. So clearly this is not great, and this is what we decided to update. This policy not only factored in students' marital status, but it's inherently heteronormative. Additionally, the final sentence of the policy is not true because MSU opted for gender inclusive housing on campus prior to the pandemic. So we were upholding this policy as recently as summer 2024. And members of our team had been raising concerns about this policy because one, it didn't work for anybody. Two, not every coordinator fully enforced the policy. And three, the policy was discriminatory and it failed to equitably support all students regardless of their gender identity and or expression. So the catalyst for this policy was a series of emails we received, and we're going to review them on the next slide. Okay, so we did paraphrase, but we felt like these excerpts really exemplify the impact that the former policy was having on various members of the MSU community. So the catalyst was an email that was received by a program director from a student, and they wrote in September 2022 and said, as someone that identifies as a gay man and is listed on my university profile, this policy seems pretty antiquated and borderline homophobic. So with that feedback, the program director forwarded that to us and then also added some additional context. And she said, I believe that he would be put in an inequitable or uncomfortable situation if we forced him to share a room with a same gender stranger, given the situation. Having that said, I'm elevating this to you and requesting that you use this information to revise the MSU policy. And This feedback was initially shared with our leadership team, and it was sort of disseminated through the appropriate teams and ended up coming to Haley and I, and we were asked to co-chair a task force to revisit this policy and bring together members of the campus community for discussions around revising the policy. So to review the process that we took, we started with a task force that consisted of campus partners, including administrators, faculty, and on-campus specialists. And everyone brought different expertise and perspectives to the issues. In the task force, we reviewed Education Abroad's guiding principles that are in direct conflict with the previous policy. We discussed the challenges and concerns in enacting a more inclusive policy and Education Abroad programming, collected benchmarking data from other Big Ten institutions, and drafted policy and proposed procedural recommendations to EA leadership. After we created the task force, we held meetings to discuss the new policy, and then we organized a faculty focus group to ensure that we fully considered the perspective of faculty directors on Education Abroad programs. The policy was announced at the Advisory Council on Education Abroad meeting in September 2023. This is attended by representatives from your college. This policy has been shared with program directors multiple times through the PD memo, which is sent out monthly, and in addition to this, the policy update has been disseminated through the EA newsletter. After the announcement, we began assigning implementation tasks to EA staff, and implementation is currently ongoing, and that this is a living policy that we are adapting as necessary. Okay, so as co-chairs, Haley and I decided that we wanted to identify some guiding principles to help clarify our intentions and goals, and then also the next steps that we wanted to take for the policy. So Education Abroad currently observes this values framework where we put students first, think innovatively, promote DEI, work with integrity, hold each other accountable, ourselves accountable, and also attempt to maintain an educator mindset. So in reviewing these principles, we ultimately felt like this helped us to kind of frame what we wanted to do for the policy. And we also looked at some other policies at the university just to keep everything relevant in mind. So another policy that we sort of looked to help keep intentions at the focus of this discussion with the task force was the university's AVP policy, or anti-discrimination policy. So we drafted these goals with the understanding that by creating a policy for the most underserved students, everyone will benefit. So our goals were to create a policy that prioritizes students' physical and emotional well-being, affirms and supports students' gender identities and/or expressions, fosters an equitable, inclusive, and welcoming housing environment for all students on Education Abroad programs, expands program choices, and mitigates both the real and perceived barriers of participation for non-binary and transgender students, and lastly, to support the health, safety, and security of all students, regardless of their gender identity. Okay, and this is our new policy, which you can see on our website, but then we're also going to review here. So I'm just going to read this out loud. The Office for Education Abroad is committed to fostering an equitable, inclusive, and welcoming environment where students' gender identities and/or expressions are respected and affirmed. The Office for Education Abroad observes the MSU Gender Inclusive Housing Policy on MSU-sponsored faculty-directed programs, both internationally and domestically, contingent upon location and housing availability. While a gender-inclusive housing community is not guaranteed on Education Abroad programs, the office will try to prioritize partners and providers who can accommodate gender-inclusive housing requests and are committed to equity and inclusion. Housing providers may not be able to confirm gender-inclusive housing availability until 6 weeks prior to the program start date. If a student has concerns about their housing assignment as it pertains to their gender identity and/or expression that need to be addressed sooner than the 6 weeks, they are encouraged to contact their Education Abroad program coordinator. In the event that gender-inclusive housing cannot be accommodated on an MSU-sponsored faculty-directed program, housing assignments will be determined using the gender reported by the student in Campus Solutions. Students are responsible for providing and updating their gender information in Campus Solutions through the Office of the Registrar. Okay, so as you can imagine, there are always going to be growing pains when you're implementing a policy that is essentially striving to address some kind of broader systemic inequity or issue. And, we really try not to be reactive when updating policies. But we also want to acknowledge that there are consequences to student success when we fail to address the impact that the policies we've created have on students. So we're hoping to address any challenges that arise as the result of this policy on an ongoing basis through the practical application of this policy in order to continuously support the MSU community. And we also wanted to call attention to some similar groups and initiatives that are happening on campus that are sort of adopting a living definition of things like student success or global learning. So the Spartan Global Learning Initiative is one example. They are adopting a living definition of global learning. And then the Campus Student Success Group is also adopting a living definition of student success. So you may have heard recently, and there's like 5 areas that the university wants to focus on. But this is subject to change based on feedback that they're receiving from the MSU community and from students. So with how we're approaching this new policy and how it applies to the Center for Global Learning and Programming Abroad, we want to take a similar approach. This is my favorite part of the presentation. So we're going to talk about what GIH is and is not. So gender inclusive housing is a values-based policy, and it's meant to foster a sense of community for allies and LGBTQ plus students. It is something the Office for Education Abroad will prioritize on faculty-led programming, both existing and new, when possible. Now for what it's not. It is not a conduct policy, and students are still held to the statement of responsibility they sign when they apply. It is not a roommate selection policy, and we actively encourage faculty not to frame it this way. It is not designed to support romantic relationships between students that may or may not be happening. It is not indicative of a student's allyship or identity, and it's also not guaranteed on every faculty-led program. So going back to the not being indicative of their allyship or identity, this may be brought up on pre-departure orientation or on-site as students get to know one another. And if this happens, we encourage you to reiterate the values-based nature of this policy, remind students not to make assumptions about why a person may have opted in or not to gender-inclusive housing, and also remind them how it's meant to create a safe community for students. Okay, so your students are being presented with gender-inclusive housing in their application to faculty-directed programs. So all MSU-sponsored faculty-directed programs have the same language on their program applications. And we link out to the MSU gender-inclusive housing policy, both as it exists on the REHS website and then also on the Education Abroad website. At multiple points in the application process, because we're really trying to encourage students to engage with the policy and understand what it is that they are opting into. So the policy is linked, and students are meant to understand that if they opt in, they are agreeing to be assigned a housing arrangement with students with all gender identities and expressions. And they do this by checking the box yes or no. So if they don't check the box yes, then they don't opt in. We also have students sign various acknowledgments, sort of additional checkpoints, being like, okay, you really did read this policy, right? So they sign acknowledgments that say they have read and understand the MSU gender inclusive housing policy. They understand that if they do not opt in, or if gender inclusive housing is not available on their program, that housing is going to be assigned based on their gender in Canvas Solutions. They also have to acknowledge that they're responsible for updating their personal data through the Office of the Registrar. And they acknowledge that their housing assignment and gender inclusive housing might not be determined, or it might not be even feasible on their program, and that they can typically expect to hear around the 6-week point prior to departure about GRH feasibility. So if they have concerns that they need to have addressed sooner, they will contact their program coordinator. So this is the process and timeline our office is observing for students who do opt in to gender-inclusive housing. So a student will decide whether or not to opt into GRH during the application process, just as Hope went over in the previous slide. The program location will then be reviewed for security concerns by Global Safety. But if the program is approved or tentatively approved for gender-inclusive housing, the program coordinator will work with the program directors and or housing providers to determine if GRH can be accommodated. And by this, we generally mean logistically, if it can be accommodated. If GRH can be accommodated, coordinators will not confirm feasibility until after the application deadline. This is because we need to have the final roster before we can start working with the provider to make housing arrangements with students. If it cannot be accommodated, coordinators will inform students and provide the housing request form to students' profiles to meet alternative accommodations. Housing assignments and gender-inclusive housing availability may not be determined by housing providers until 6 weeks prior to the program start date, which Hope just reviewed in the previous slide, but this is very important. And it's because we want to protect and uplift the students who this policy was meant for. We do encourage them to write to their program coordinator as they have concerns, housing concerns related to their gender identity and or expression. So one thing I do want to call attention to is the program location will be reviewed for security concerns by Global Safety. Haley and I have collaborated with the Office for Global Safety. We have Gabby here. Hi, Gabby. Thank you so much for being here. And Gabby and her team are reviewing each location for concerns that may be specific to gender, identity, expression, etc. In the countries where the program is slated to run. So if there's legislation that is actively targeting members of the queer and trans community, Gabby's team is looking at this and flagging it. So I just wanted to call that out really quick because that is a very important piece of this. But we're just not going into detail about it during this particular session. So I wanted to call attention to that really quick.
Yeah, there's very robust criteria that's been developed for assessing the safety of different program locations. Okay, so we just want to reiterate the importance of a values-based policy that's created for the most historically underserved students. So after the announcement of gender-inclusive housing policy at the ACA meeting, we contacted the student who was the catalyst for the change, and we sent them the updated language. And it says that I'm at a loss for words. There's not a lot of times in my life that I can visibly see change go into action, but I'm beyond grateful to see MSU become a more equitable place, one suggestion at a time. I definitely think this covers the need, and the fact that it falls in line with Broadway University policy is even better in my eyes. I'm glad we can make a difference here. So this is not to pat ourselves on the backs, but it's just to exemplify the importance of a policy that serves all students. And there was a member on our task force who said very early on in our meetings that trickle-up policies are effective. And if you build a policy for the most historically underserved students, everyone is going to benefit.
So a little bit of patting ourselves on the back, I think, is justified. This has been a heavy lift, and also we're very grateful for all of you coming and being interested in exploring the applications of this policy, some of the nuances. There are absolutely going to be growing pains, and so as questions come up for you, Haley and I are more than happy to be a resource, but also your program coordinators have a direct line to us all of the time, and so we are also happy to, kind of collaborate with them and with you to kind of help smooth over any bumps along the road. One thing I did want to talk about before we open it up for questions is assessment. So I do think it's going to be very important for us to assess the efficacy of the policy. Is the policy being received positively by students? Do they feel like it is actually achieving the goal or serving the population that it was designed to uplift and support ultimately at the end of the day? So we're trying to decide the best ways to go about doing assessment. Originally, we had planned on implementing this for summer 25, and we ended up having to implement it early because of a little bit of an administrative error on our part. So we started implementing this early in this fall. So for fall programming as well, some programs were already starting to look at gender inclusive housing. So we are starting to receive data. We have, data about who is opting in and things like this. And we're hoping to keep track of that and be able to report out to the community about how things are going with the policy. So I would just want to encourage, if you lead a program or if you work with folks who lead programs, please have them give us feedback as well about how the conversations are going with students on site or in pre-departure sessions. Let us know if additional housing concerns are coming up during the program. Obviously nothing confidential. That would then go to Gabby, probably Gabby's office, Global Safety. But, keep an open line with us. We'd love to hear about how this experience is for you too. And yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to add there. But thank you so much for coming today. Please feel free to encourage your colleagues to attend future sessions. Ryan has also very kindly been videoing today and is going to Frankenstein a video together for us that you can share out with your colleagues in the colleges. Please just remind them, though, that as this is a living procedural process, things could change. So they definitely need to be checking in with their coordinator to make sure that something hasn't changed or deviated from what we presented today, just because we are real-time workshopping and facilitating this process and this implementation. Good.